a systematic assault on civic space, from crackdowns on protests, silencing dissent, to restrictions on NGOs, journalists, and marginalized voices. What was taken for granted for so many years, the freedom to organize, to speak out, to participate in public life, is now under siege in many parts of the world, including in G7 countries. Today, we will begin by grounding ourselves in realities of shrinking civic space globally, and then we'll move forward for solutions, resilience strategies, and actions that can offer hope. This session is a call to urgency and also a call to action. It explores concrete strategies for building resilience within civic space. Panelists, which I will introduce shortly, will share experiences from different regions, highlighting the risks and attacks on civic space, but also sharing hope, resilience strategies, and ideas for action. With the G7's role in upholding democratic values and human rights, this discussion offers key insights into how all of us can better support civil society, particularly the vulnerable and marginalized group. With that introduction, I'm really honored and privileged to introduce our distinguished panel today. We have, and as I introduce them, please come and take your seats. Kim Vance Mugaba, Director of Programs and Partnership at Eagle Canada. Kim is a respected advocate for LGBTQI+ rights and social justice. As Director of Partnership and Programs at Eagle Canada, she leads national and international initiatives to advance equality, inclusion, and human rights. Kim brings over decades of experience working with civil society, governments, and multilateral organizations to address the shrinking of civic space and human rights and marginalized communities. Welcome, Kim. We also have on the panel Olusi Ibisisi. He's the Director of Nigeria Network of NGOs from Nigeria. Olusi is a leading voice for civil society in Nigeria. As CEO of the Nigeria Network of NGOs, he supports over 3,000 members, organizations working across development, human rights, and governance sectors. Olusi has deep expertise in strengthening the enabling environment for nonprofits in restrictive settings and has advised numerous global bodies on protecting civic space in Africa. Hadi Marafat is the Executive Director of Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization. He's currently based in exile in Ottawa. Hadi is a human rights defender and researcher with a focus on transitional justice and accountability. In Afghanistan, as Executive Director, he works with Afghan civil society, victims of human rights violations, and international partners to document abuse and promote justice, both inside Afghanistan and in exile. Hadi continues to lead the vital work in exile to protect Afghan civic space and human rights defenders. Last but not least, Nina Potraska. Nina is is in Ottawa, but from Ukraine. Nina is the Ukrainian human rights activist and peace builder with extensive experience working in conflict-affected settings. She currently leads programs at Ukrainian Women's Fund, supporting women's rights defenders and civil society organizations navigating the complex challenges of war and displacement. Nina advocates globally for the protection of civic actors operating under extreme, fragile, conflict setting conditions. Thank you, and with that, I will take my seat, and we're going to engage in what I hope and promises to be a lively conversation. Okay, so thank you again. Kim, to start off today's conversation, could you just give us an overview of the current state of global civic space, and particularly focusing on LGBTIQ+, and other vulnerable communities, where are you seeing more pressures and challenges?
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I think it's important to name that we're in a particular moment of backlash, but I want to also acknowledge that the backlash that exists now has come because of great gains and progress that have been made. When I first started this work, I'll date myself here, in the early 2000s, and we started UN advocacy work, you couldn't even say the words lesbian or gay in a UN space. It triggered an immediate no action motion by states, and the discussion was shut down. So we couldn't even talk about these issues. So 25 years later, we've come a long way. So there's been a lot of progress, and this backlash is in many ways a result of that progress. So I want to acknowledge that it comes because good stuff has happened. And part of the focus of our work was to build strong foundational institutions and to contribute to significant normative gains. And part of why we did that as a strategy for our movements and many others is because we knew the backlash would come. We knew it would come. And one of the ways, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the hope and resilience section of this session today, one of the ways you can resist backlash is to have those strong foundational supports and institutions. What I want to say is that the backlash we're experiencing now, it's not the kind of expected antagonists that have disappointed us the most. We're used to folks taking particular issues with what we're advocating for. And in many ways, a number of those states and civil society actors have remained pretty consistent over the years. I think what is most troubling in this particular moment is the retreat and silence of our traditional allies. In my 25 years of doing this work, we've seen the United States flip-flop quite a bit, although there's been significant progress since about 2011. But we've seen that sort of back and forth with the US. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about the US today. But it's the retreat of the Dutch and the Swedes, people that we have counted on as state allies and actors in many spaces for a number of years, both in a funding kind of perspective in terms of development assistance, but also politically and at policy levels. And it's also the fracturing, I think, within our civil society alliances, with strong movements that we have traditionally counted on as allies, the women's movement, the anti-racism movement, and others. Although I do want to give a little shout out to W7. I've seen their communique now, and we really appreciate that they're specifically naming and upholding LGBT rights. So, but I do think that the kind of retreat of those allies has been the most pressure that we've experienced, to have to go back and forge those alliances again, and to kind of reroute our work in a very intersectional way. And I will say we're as guilty about maybe siloing our issues over the years as many others, and that this is a key moment to kind of look at intersectional work in a new way. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go on.
You touched on issues of retreats and freeze and funding from a number of countries, including our allies, so traditional allies for the marginalized communities. Where do you see the more pressure, particularly, and also what can countries like Canada do and to step up in the face of current crisis?
Right. Well, I want to highlight that there's a number of organizations that sort of went into kind of key moment of action around, in particular, the retreat of the U.S. Funding. And our colleagues at Outright International, based in New York, have done a key sort of assessment of the impacts of some of this withdrawal of funding from the U.S. It's pretty devastating. They had 42 countries participating in their research. And I mean, we're actually talking about real lives, okay? We're talking about lack of access to HIV medication, for instance, that will result in people dying. And I think we've heard some of these messages, but we're also talking about the rollback. Remember I talked about those institutions. Well, those institutions require support. They require people to have access to lawyers, for instance. They require people to know about what their rights are. And so a lot of the programs and the organizations that have been affected can no longer deliver those key services to help people advocate for themselves, which is particularly critical. The other thing is that not everyone is impacted in the same way, and we know this. And even within our own LGBT communities, for instance, trans and intersex folks are particularly vulnerable, both because they are small communities that receive very little funding, but also because they've been at the nexus of kind of a political football. So if you've seen sort of some of the comments coming out of the US, targeting, in particular, trans folks. This is a very small portion of the population, very small numbers of people that are warranting executive orders from the president. So that kind of politics, coupled with the retreat in funding, is putting those members of our community at particularly terrible risk. What can Canada do? Well, there's a lot of great things Canada can do. I want to acknowledge that my colleagues in the Dignity Network Canada have issued a call to action for the Canadian government. We know that Canada can't alone fill the gap that's been caused, for instance, by US Development Assistance retreat, or the Dutch retreat, or the Swedish retreat. But it can do more, and we've articulated ways that it can do more. It can also do more in terms of the technical ways in which it operates, more flexibility. With the funding, for instance, we have a number of partners that we are working with right now on Global Affairs Canada funding. And we've asked them, can those partners pivot their activities? Can they be more responsive to the kinds of pressures that they're experiencing? We need strong leadership. Canada is in a key moment. It's the head of the G7. It's also the leader of the LGBT core group within the Organization of American States. So we need really strong policy and advocacy leadership. We need them not to retreat on these issues.
Thank you, Kim. Ulysses, from your perspective in Nigeria, what are the major ways civic space in Nigeria is being constrained right now? And which groups or sectors are being hit hardest?
So usually when I hear the word civic space, I always like to use the definition by OECD, which would be the laws, the policies, the regulations that helps us to be able to claim our rights, freedom of association, assembly, and expression as a people. When I took over in my role as Executive Director of the Nigerian Network of NGOs, one negative narrative that has driven the need for there to be laws that regulate civil society has been the conversation around terrorism financing or money laundering. That started 2012 when I took over. And just 2 months ago, there was a careless statement from a US senator that said that USAID is being used as a conduit for money laundering. All right, then that raised the interest again of the National Assembly to start an investigation around NGOs and the funding of terrorism. So if there's one law that you found being used consistently to shrink civic space, it will be those around terrorism financing. The other is that around cyber crimes, and you find the Cyber Crimes Act of Nigeria now being used a lot in terms of cyber stalking. So when someone is very critical of the system now, that law is actually activated as well. Then the other bit is around censorship that we've seen recently. One major one is the one that happened 3 days ago, where someone sang about the present situation in Nigeria and asked the president's son to tell the father to do something about it, and that music was banned. But we've seen a lot of that happening before now as well. There's threats and arrests of journalists, the disappearances. Many times you find us leaving our major work to start protecting journalists and bloggers from either being arrested or being detained for far too long. We've also seen some subnational regulations. So Nigeria has about 36 states and plus the capital. We've seen the need for aid coordination and the use of laws around aid coordination, especially those around humanitarian action, being used again to shrink civic space. Then also surveillance is becoming something that is huge. You're seeing now the use of the courts, sometimes to restrict protests or to call for outright ban on protests, as it were. So by and large, that's what we're seeing. But civil society is also responding. You're seeing expression affected a lot when you look at the impact of civic space. Journalists, either they are self-censoring or in some cases, when they do publish stories that, especially bloggers, right, you find them being arrested more at the subnational level. If you break it into two, you find the federal government being more tolerant than governments at the subnational level. And again, governments at the subnational level is more closer to the people as it were. So giving you the landscape, civil society is pushing back, but each time you push back, there's another form of attack on the space that is also happening. We've had in recent times some progress around registration for nonprofits and the regulations that affect nonprofit. In fact, when you look at the AML-CFT, which is the anti-money laundering and countering of terrorism financing laws that we have in Africa at this time, Nigeria seems to have a more progressive law in that the law is now recommendation 8 compliant, which is a global process that looks at those laws. So while there's some backsliding, we've also seen some level of progress. However, the heat is now on that statement that is creating a lot of challenge for us in the sector, as it were.
So you mentioned about the setbacks, but also progress. How did the civil society achieve that progress? How they are adapting or resisting to the legal and political pressure that they're facing? Can you give us an example of how they are mobilizing to push back?
Yeah, I think it's been a process of balancing collaboration with confrontation. For example, I give you the example of the Companies and Allied Matters Act, which is a law that regulates the formation and operation of nonprofits in Nigeria. The law itself hasn't been reviewed in the last 30 or so years. So when there was a moment for the law to be reviewed, a couple of civil society organizations made proposals to government. However, those proposals, some were taken, but was expanded. So there were some aspects of that law that were contentious, and civil society had to push back. Both religious nonprofits and traditional nonprofits had to push back. And then engagement started with the lawmakers to look at how do we review those aspects of the law. That brought together the regulators, the civil society, and also the National Assembly to sit down on the table. But we had some civil society organizations that also decided to go to the courts to use the judiciary. So we had a judgment from the judiciary that says, yes, some sections of that law were not in sync with international human rights. Then the regulator decided to appeal. So while we have the judicial advocacy happening, we did also have the regular advocacy processes ongoing, as it were. Before I left for this meeting, we had to sit down with the committee of the National Assembly looking at those laws again and then seeing how we can improve them. We've proposed some texts on what needs to change, of course, linking them with international human rights laws and how that can help us to claim rights, those associated with freedom of association. But the judicial advocacy has meant that we can't go far because there seems to be some conflicting understanding around when there is a matter before the courts. You have to allow it to be exhausted before you then come back to take action in that regards. But that shows how we've been able to balance collaboration with confrontation in being able to address that particular issue.
It's good to see, to see repression and restrictions on civic space. It's sad, but it's really hopeful to see that civil society are finding ways to adapt to the environment and resist and push back against the repression that they experience. Now, moving from Nigeria to Afghanistan, where it's a different level of
extensively been targeted. The same UN report documented violation affecting 173 journalists and media workers, with 163 cases attributed to the Taliban. This included 122 arbitrary arrests and detention, 58 instances of ill treatment, 33 instances of threats and intimidation, and 12 cases of incommunicado detention. Additionally, 6 journalists have been killed in this period, and obviously some of them, the ISKP, which is the Islamic State for Khorasan province, were also responsible for the killing of this journalist, and that's another group that's operating on the theater of Afghanistan. Further reports indicate that between August 2021 and September 2024, the Taliban detained journalists over 250 times. Moreover, in 3 years since they returned to power, 141 journalists have been arrested or detained. So when it comes to the situation of women journalists particularly, and so their situation is even more dire. Over 60% of Afghanistan's women journalists have had to stop working since the Taliban returned to power. And in many provinces, women have disappeared entirely from the media landscape. These figures that I just cited demonstrate the severe challenges and dangers that are faced by human rights defenders as well as journalists in Afghanistan. I have to also mention that often when we talk, obviously, it's not that just the journalists and human rights defenders or women rights defenders that have been targeted, but we see certain communities as a whole being targeted in Afghanistan. And of course, if you consider the women and half of the population of Afghanistan, so the Taliban, as you know, engaged in a series of anti-women campaigns. They systematically dismantled the legal frameworks and institutions such as the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission and processes that were promoting gender equality in Afghanistan, and then replacing them with their own ambiguous and repressive legal orders and structures. These changes have significantly impacted women's and girls' fundamental rights, including education, health, employment, and many more. And to date, the Taliban have issued at least 70 decrees, orders, and guidelines affecting all aspects of women's lives and rights. And that include freedom of movement, dress code, and access to education, employment, and many more. There are also other communities, such as the Hazara Shia community in Afghanistan. And the Taliban violence against this particular community is systemic and multifaceted, involving forced displacement, land grabs, home demolitions, killings, mass detention, and purging Hazaras from government roles and impositions of heavy religious taxation because they're the Shia Muslim in Afghanistan and the majority are Sunni Muslim. And on top of that, we have also seen this genocidal campaign by the Islamic State of Khorasan province against this particular community. And just to give you some examples, between 2025 and September 2024, the Islamic State of Khorasan province carried out up to 100 mass casualty attacks targeting these specific communities. And that basically includes the Hazara schools, education centers, sports clubs, almost every aspect of their lives that have been targeted. And also our documentation revealed that the unlawful detention and torture and as well as the execution of communities and members of the resistance group, those who are still resisting the Taliban oppressive rule. So they have been particularly targeted, and we have documented serious atrocity crimes against members of this group, and particularly in the province of Panjshir and Baghlan provinces, which is in northern Afghanistan. And then if you look actually in the 2024 General Human Rights Monitoring, and that particularly indicate that the Taliban detained on average of 20 people per month on allegation of ties either to resistance group or doing some work related to women's rights or human rights in Afghanistan. So, and I think this is highlighting, the scale of ongoing abuses against whoever is actually standing up against the Taliban in Afghanistan. So I stop here.
Well, thank you, Adi, for sharing that really sad stories of what's happening in the country. But can you tell us briefly about the risk and pressure that victims of violations of human rights and human rights defenders and journalists of Afghan origin face in exile? I know that, that inside the country it's bad, but are they safe in exile?
Well, my organization, we have worked for over a decade, with victims and survivors of the conflict and the war in Afghanistan. So we have profiled over 15,000 victims. And we established a museum back in Afghanistan, which called the Afghanistan Center for Memory and Dialogue. And now we have an online version of that, which is called the Afghanistan Memory Home, so you can check it online. So to put it actually, the victims and survivors of the Afghan conflict, and speaking of, the pre-2001, it was estimated around 2 million by the Afghan government and around 1.5 million victims. By the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. And then, after the US and NATO intervention or invasion, whatever you call it, over 100,000 civilians have lost their life in the conflict. And unfortunately, they remain, the most marginalized voices in Afghanistan, and of course beyond Afghanistan. So when they stand up and talk about accountability, when they talk about justice, and they talk about their rights, and so they have to always again suffer, and because of calling for justice and calling for accountability. Well, I mean, inside Afghanistan, obviously, to again talk a little bit, So when you talk about the survivors, and especially women, ethnic and religious minorities, and particularly members of the LGBTQI community, they face a lot of pressure and constant threats. And of course, the same applies to human rights defenders, and the same applies, to many others, victims and survivors, that not related actually, let's say, to the Taliban atrocities, but also to other conflict parties. And of course, we also know that that there are this biometric data that has been collected under the previous government, which is basically fingerprints and data of everyone. So, and now the Taliban has access to that, and so they go and obviously check that one, and through that they identify and target, and particularly members of the former government and members of obviously the former National and Defense and Security Forces. But beyond Afghanistan, no, absolutely they are not safe. We have seen that Taliban sympathizers in European countries, but also in North America, that they have threatened, exiled survivors, exiled victims, and also exiled human rights defenders, that they call for justice and accountability. We have also seen, that some exiled Afghan human rights defenders, and that they have been receiving threats on WhatsApp or social media, from accounts linked, to the Taliban and their allies. We have also seen, how, human rights defenders, but also the victims and survivors have to censor even themselves in exile, because of, not only because of, themselves not being safe here, but also because of, their relatives and families back in Afghanistan. And I think, when it comes, to the issue of, human rights, women human rights defenders, so it was very hard, for them to stand and to talk about these issues. And particularly those human rights defenders, that they have faced detention, torture, and even sexual harassment and rape in the Taliban detention facilities. We have recently documented over 13 cases of women and girls that have been detained just because of, violating the dress code in Afghanistan. And that was coming from two specific areas. And again, because of the intersectionality of these issues with ethnicity and religion, so they have gone actually specifically for women that they were, members of certain ethnic and religious communities. And some of them that they managed to, come outside of Afghanistan, and it has been really, really difficult, to come and testify, including with an international accountability mechanism such as the International Criminal Court. And part of the reason was this security reasons and safety concerns, that they had both for themselves but also for their families.
Thank you, Hadi. Nina, you work in a context of armed conflict. How has the war further closed civic space in Ukraine, especially for activists, human rights defenders, and local civil society organizations?
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. And last few days, I was thinking about this speech because it's a little bit challenging because last years putting me in situations or position when you need to revise yourself, you need to check before you would open your mouth. And of course, it's not only because of the war, it's also because, of course, living through full-scale invasion, and I'm still rooted to Ukrainian context because as a researcher, I'm conducting few research related to Ukraine, and I'm doing in-depth interviews with the ordinary people who live in close to contact line from both sides. So it's, and every 2 months, every month, I'm traveling for a few weeks, for 1 month to Ukraine from Ottawa. So I cannot consider myself like a human rights defender in exile, or I'm still rooted. And it's a little bit difficult for me to even introduce myself for like where I'm from. I don't know. I'm trying to keep this balance because I understand that living in a war context and analyze war context under the war reality, it's difficult. Of course, it's better to like observe everything from the safe space, but to be rooted to the context, and I'm human rights defender. I consider myself as a human rights defender with more than 20 years experience. And I remember my country since very beginning of like first steps towards democracy. And of course, I know, like I can compare how I feel myself now, how I feel myself 10 years ago, how I felt myself 5 years ago and 20 years ago. And of course, all these steps we're doing now, it's not towards democracy, unfortunately. And of course, it's because of internal processes. Of course, it's because of the war. And of course, war can lead and profound restrictions for civil society. But we need to find the place to make a stop, or to wake up and talk frankly about no, it's enough, because otherwise we will lose our achievements after many years. Because in Ukraine, for a few years, I was one of the co-coordinator of Women March, and last years we were able to organize march demonstration for a few thousand of women and of people. And I'm not sure we can do the same now, or even I'm not sure if we can talk about the agenda which is really touching us, because war, it's not only one thing which is bothering us during the nowadays, because of course it's a shelling, of course it's unclear future, the economy going down, and people are struggling with to find a way how they can survive. But in the same time, during my speech in front of the people, I need to check myself many times because I have doubts if I'm not like abusing any new law which restrict or which, I don't know even. You see, I'm trying to find right words, correct words to describe that there is no space to speak about many things inside of society. And this is, I think, the main challenge for everybody. And we have the same with the American democracy standards, which is also going, I don't know, to nowhere because I'm just back from US. But we try to advocate something, I don't know even what I'm trying to advocate. We try to advocate participation in a peace process, but it's like you're talking to DAF and people because you're trying to convince them that sustainable peace can lead us to something good, but you don't know what words you can use. Because before our network was called like a Women Network for Inclusive Peace. And then we realized, no, inclusive peace, we cannot use this word anymore. We need to change for anything else. I don't know, maybe it's participation, but it's not cover our idea. Maybe it's endurable or lasting peace. It's also not include all meaning we are trying to put inside. And I asked it direct US representative, like, give me the vocabulary I can use, because I don't know which words I can, with which words I can talk to you. And which words we can use in here, or which words I can use back home, because in Ukraine we have a different vocabulary too. And this is putting me like in this position which I hopeless. I don't know what to say. And it's terrible because one by one countries losing this, I don't know, democracy status, or I don't know how to explain this. And even in Canada, just right before my travel to US, there was a news, and I started to hear from the news like we have to, it's more about Canadian and US economical, I don't know, something. I don't want to call it war, because war is something terrible. I don't want to multiply this word. But my daughter also watched this news and asked me like, we're going to protect our values, we're going to protect our lifestyle. What is going on? Is it still a safe place to land or not? Or we have to move again? Because it's a very dangerous rhetoric, because I heard this many times in different contexts, because my first dissertation, which I never defend, was about political participation. And I tried to be everywhere, for example, in Belarus during the protest, in Russia during the protest. I always was in the middle of the protest, and in Ukraine. And you know, this now it's trigger for me. When we are protecting our values, it means that something going wrong.
Thank you, Nina. It shows also that the experience you just shared about your trip last week to the US, it also shows how interconnected the world is in terms of civic space as well. So the repression of civic space in one place can directly affect civic space and civil society actors, their freedom of expression, and how they do advocacy in a far corner of the world in another place. So the fact that we need to, for example, use a certain words or do not use a certain words when we engage with politicians or policymakers in a G7 country just is a sort of stark reminder of two things. One, how connected civic space is around the world, and that's the the one thing. And the second thing, that the repression does not acknowledge or know borders. You know, if something happens in Africa, civil society organizations in another part of the country, in another part of the world, can feel and experience the consequences. But it's not all doom and gloom. Excuse me. We are now going to go to the second part of our conversation, after which we'll open it to questions and comments from the audience. So in the second part, we'll try to be a bit, sort of infuse some hope and optimism to the discussion. What our panelists did was give us a good understanding and a nuanced understanding of the challenges that civil society actors around the world are facing. We're now going to look at, where are pockets of hope and resilience and opportunities for action. So with that, Kim, back to you. Despite the shrinking of civic space, where do you see examples of hope among LGBTQI plus communities, but also in general vulnerable communities? What innovative strategies have this group used to counter the repression and build resilience in the civic space?
Thanks. Well, I sort of alluded to this in the beginning, that one of the important pieces of work was that infrastructure and that foundation building. So one of the important pieces, and I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'll talk a little bit in the Canadian context because we work domestically, but I also work internationally. So when EGAL started over 30 years ago, it started as a litigating organization. That was the majority of the work that EGAL did. And over the years, as we were successful, and I will say that EGAL Canada has never lost a court challenge in its entire history, we started working more on substantive equality issues and less on litigation, to the extent that we didn't even really have a legal department anymore up until about 5 years ago. But guess what? We have a legal department again, and it's one of our busiest pillars within our organization. Just in 2024, we're involved in 7 new court cases and interventions here domestically in Canada. So I would say that that's an area of resilience and hope for us. We have had success there. A number of other people have mentioned the courts and upholding those institutions and using those normative gains in a moment where we really need to lean in on them, where we see the backlash and the backsliding happening. So that's one area, and we're hoping that we're going to keep our track record and not lose any of those 7 court cases. We see progress and we see hope. The legal community has been incredibly supportive. We could not do that legal advocacy work without the pro bono work of law firms and legal clinics and lawyers in Canada and abroad, so it's been incredibly important. The other area is, we have to remember that, like, for instance, I'm Zambian by marriage, and in Zambia, my partner was never legal. They were a criminal, and they still are a criminal today. And I am a criminal when I enter that country with my partner. And there are organizations that we work with across the globe who could never register. They've never been allowed to register. And so this is a key moment to sort of, I think, go back to some of the advocacy strategies that have existed and persisted through moments and times of severe restrictions and crackdowns. For many allies that we work with, that this is not a new scenario. And so there's a lot of learning that needs to happen there. There's a lot of sort of refocusing on some of the strategies that worked. I was at a speech given a number of years ago by a colleague of mine with the Coalition of African Lesbians, and she said, "We didn't dismantle apartheid in South Africa through donor log frames and theories of change. We did it because we were on the ground, mobilizing. We weren't paid. We didn't have day jobs to do this work. We did it because we knew what we had to do, we organized, and we got the job done. And I think we're at a critical moment there, certainly in our movements, to do that. In my lifetime, there's never been anything called a gay job. That changed over time, but when I started this work, you know, folks in our communities had a gay job and then they had a day job. And so the work was done off paid hours. And so, you know, we're trying to be creative. We're trying to look at ways to reduce the resilience on reduce the reliance on donor governments, looking at investment strategies, looking at cooperatives, all kinds of interesting ways that we can organize and not be dependent on single government donors. So I think there's a lot of that resilience, there's a lot of that hope that's happening, a lot of examination of micro enterprises and looking at and how they can operate. So I think there are those things that are happening. We're also seeing, in the face of some of the resistance, some governments show particular leadership, and it's really important for us to be in these spaces. And I'll note the fact that, you know, the P7 is an example, and Igal's leadership within the Pride 7 group is an example of hope and resilience and needing to be in a new space of governance and global governance. And we are having a summit in May that is funded by the Canadian government, both WAGE and GAC. And so those are positive signs of hope and resilience under this Canadian leadership, and we welcome them.
Thank you. Lucy, what kind of international support and solidarity would have the most impact on the protection of civic space in Nigeria and also beyond, in Africa?
I think one that we need to focus on would be on how to ensure that we have a UN system that works. And I'll tell you why. Because every of the work that we do here needs to find its a safe space somewhere. And I do think it has to be within a global governance architecture that can help to peer pressure other governments. While we've seen progress in terms of some of the issues that we may face locally, and some of the solutions that we are seeing, they've been drawn from that global energy. We need to now protect that global energy. But as at last year, we've had a restriction of civil society within, the UN system itself, where we've had to now start engaging with governments to ensure that the space for civil society can be protected at the UN. The other bit is to focus on the high level of mis- and disinformation or negative narratives around civil society globally, and feeding that back into the recent upset that we now have within the aid architecture, including how we are financing development itself. The mis- and disinformation is so high that it is affecting civil society organizations in developing and emerging countries. Whereas I'd also like to spotlight some hope that we're seeing. For instance, just last month, on the floor of the National Assembly, we saw the passage of the second reading, the Human Rights Defenders Bill, all right, which would protect human rights defenders in Nigeria. We've also seen some level of progressive or proactive engagement with the lawmakers. For example, recall that in my earlier speech I mentioned the fact that there was a careless narrative that came out of the recent funding freeze, and that the National Assembly did set up a committee to investigate the civil society. But, civil society met, engaged with the leadership of the National Assembly, and they've been able to find a way to reduce the pressure on civil society. The other bit is, again, around the issue I mentioned, where we've seen the use of the cyber crimes law being used, to target dissenting voices. While the ECOWAS court have said the section of that law should be reviewed, it has been reviewed now. And though the interpretation is still a bit tricky, but we've seen progress in that as well. 2-3 days ago, the National Human Rights Commission in Nigeria also issued an advisory on how institutions and government should make use of the Cybercrimes Act. So I just thought I should mention those types of hopes. But when you look at the National Human Rights Commission, for instance, it is situated within a global human rights cycle, which is within the United Nations Human Rights Council, that gives it some teeth. And we've always used the United Nations peer review mechanism as well, or the UPR, for us to be able to hold the system accountable to human rights. Now, connecting it back to my conversation on ensuring that the UN works, is that if everything gets dismantled at the country level, who do we report to? So that's why we must all focus our work on ensuring that global governance that can help us to claim those rights that we've mentioned, whether expression, whether association, whether assembly, that global governance stands. Whether we would find the right set of funding for them to be able to do those work, or the right set of technicalities. That's why when civil society organizations are calling for a special rapporteur, or a UN focal point on civil society, it's just so that we can have this space and this international solidarity continue to happen.
Sure. Howdy. So Afghan civil society activists, human rights defenders, continue their work in exile. And we are seeing, since a big number of the activist community was forced to leave, so there's a strong community in exile, and they're continuing the fight for human rights and democracy. What resilience and advocacy strategies have worked so far, and how activists are organizing in exile, and how they are collaborating and getting together?
Well, I mean, if you actually look, despite the displacement that we have to endure and the traumas that we are carrying with ourselves and the survivor's guilt, and also the challenges of limited resources, I think, the Afghan civil society has shown incredible perseverance and creativity. And we have found ways to keep organizing, to keep fighting, and to support each other, and more importantly, demand accountability. I will briefly touch upon, maybe, I would take some time, sorry about that, and about, 3-4 areas, that we are working on. And I think these are some of the things that we can offer as an exiled activist, and how our experiences can help, other situations and contexts, such as, let's say, Ukraine, for instance. Because we have to learn from the Syrians a lot, and from many other, situations. First and foremost is documentation. When we talk actually about, accountability for human rights violation, so there has to be a proper documentation is done. We found ways, to document, and we found ways actually back in Afghanistan as the conflict was going on to document atrocity crimes as was happening by many actors. And we continue to document human rights abuses now from exile. And it is important for us not only to help and support accountability processes, but I think it is also important, for our history and for this future generation, that this dark period in our history should not remain an entire black hole. As, for example, for some of us, during the Soviet invasion back in the 1970s, we do not know very much, and we do not know, what happened in the 1980s. But of course, if you look what happened in the last 20 years and after August 2021, so there are credible, documentation that has been done and can help accountability processes, but also help our history. So my organization, and of course many organizations, so we document gender persecution, and we also document the targeted repression of ethnic and religious minorities, as I mentioned, such as the Hazara Shia community, the Sikh and Hindu community in Afghanistan, but also the Sufi order of Islam, which is a pacifist, Islamic, kind of order, and that they have been also targeted. And then we're also documenting atrocities that are committed against supporters and members of the resistance, and I'm talking about the armed resistance group. And for those of you that you may do not know, there is actually an armed resistance going on against the Taliban. And then we also, kind of try to submit, this evidence to international accountability mechanism, including the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but also trying, to invoke universal jurisdiction. That's also an important tool to be used. And of course, we have examples of how this happened. Moving beyond, the documentation, and so far, that we have, documented, and what actually this helped. So for the first time, after years of waiting, and the Afghan civil society and victim survivors see some movement in the International Criminal Court. The ICC's investigation into the situation of Afghanistan obviously began, and back in 2007, can you believe, the preliminary examination under prosecutor Fatih Bensouda. And only in January 2025, which is a few months ago, the OTP, which is the Office of the Prosecutor, they filed application for arrest warrants against two Taliban senior leaders, obviously the Supreme Leader and also the Chief Justice. And because of the gender persecution as a crimes against humanity, also the crime against LGBTQI community. This is happening, for the first time in the investigation of the Office of the Prosecutor. And of course, we have to still see, the result of that. But the prosecutor has already indicated that he is going to issue more arrest warrants against, Taliban official and senior Taliban official, particularly at the ministerial level. So this is one of the mechanisms that we are trying, to seek accountability. And the other important mechanism is the International Court of Justice. And again, for the first time in history, 4 UN members, including Canada, Netherlands, Germany, and Australia, so they announced their intention to file a claim against the state of Afghanistan for the violation of the CEDAW. And of course, because the Taliban currently control the territory, so so in effect, this legal claim is against the Taliban. The announcement was made in September 2024, but of course, these countries have to still continue, to do some more work on that. And our understanding is, that obviously there has to be 6 months, time to pass, before a claim can be filed before the ICG. And of course, we still have a long road, to go. But I think, the mere that, fact that having, those 4 member states, including Canada, stepping in, to take Afghanistan and, of course, to make, the Afghanistan and Taliban accountable is a good sign. But again, we have to unfortunately wait and see when this legal claim will be filed. And I understand that certain legal threshold also need to be met for that. And we as an Afghan civil society are collecting evidences, to support the initiative of these 4 UN state members. Also, the universal jurisdiction is another, major area for accountability. And of course, we understand, that this is extrajudicial, extraterritorial, accountability tool. And of course, it allows, governments outside of Afghanistan to prosecute individuals who committed crimes in Afghanistan. And for that, we have a few cases, obviously, a few cases that are tried in the Netherlands, but also 1 case in the United Kingdom. And then you have also, countries, that such as Australia, that they have initiated their own their own initiative. And of course, we're hoping, to see some result, by the Australian, to kind of investigate, the misconduct of their forces in Afghanistan, and somehow to set a precedence, obviously followed by countries such as UK, the Netherlands. But I'm not talking about the United States, of course, they will never do it. I think, I went along, but of course, UN mechanism, and that's also important. And there is actually a momentum that is established. So we work closely also with the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, and so far, of course, using that. But also at the meantime, working, how we can also get an independent, impartial investigative mechanism for Afghanistan, such as the one that UN Human Rights Council actually had for Myanmar and also for Syria. And for the very first time, again, there are four countries, including, Iceland. Actually, Iceland is leading this initiative, to help support Afghanistan with the establishment of this investigative mechanism. I think I didn't talk a lot about, the strategies, more about the accountability that we demand. But I'm happy to talk, sorry, I went a little bit over time.
That was very interesting, but also informative. Nina, what gives you hope? In the face of the current conflict, what keeps you going? What keeps the Ukraine civil society going?
I have my notes. I will try to follow. I spent a few hours to find the hope, and yes, it's true. Despite of all the internal problems, because yes, of course, we have some unspeakable problems like forced mobilization or shrinking space for freedom of for speech, and I don't know what we can do with all of this from inside, especially under the war, under aggression, because it's impossible. And all these issues or topics or problems always during the war, it's not always not on time. It's just a very common response you can receive if you are addressing something, or if you critique something against like corruption or some social economical measures. It means that you could be very easily linked to Russian propaganda. But it's not Russian propaganda, it's how I feel, how I live. I don't want to live like this. And it's possible to change. And it's not the must to I don't know, make people suffering from inside and divide people inside of the country, especially under these circumstances of war. But I'm trying. And of course, the main resource for me, it's a networking, especially networking with other women's organizations from post-conflict and conflict context. And I remember my conversations with women from Afghanistan, from women from Syria, and sometimes I feel, okay, it's unbearable. I don't know what to do. But I know that my friends and sisters from Afghanistan, they're doing something same last 40 years or 30 years, all their life. And they're still alive. And they still have a hope. And to be honest, for me, I take in your hope and trying to grow my hope on your base. And second, things which also, it's research and education. I'm trying to be connected and trying to understand what is going on with us. And maybe from research position, it's easier to understand this reality. And of course, all this to be connected globally and to be rooted locally. And I don't know which networks or which other structures can support us during this time. And feminist leadership and redefining security, because security for us, it's not just borders and weapons, and we have huge securitization and militarization now, like agenda now, but it's safe life. And I always asking people who live in close to contact line, and for them, security, it's not the, I don't know, counter-defense system next to them. It's about light, it's about economical stability, it's safe housing, it's a trust, it's a mental health, it's very basic things, and ability to speak freely. Because now I receiving so many refusals to participate in the interview, and I never received this amount before. And for me, it's also the signal that maybe something going wrong inside of the society. And of course, organizing and holding space for healing, it's difficult to find this space. And maybe because Ukraine now, its country depends on others on 100%. With the budget, with the help, with the humanitarian help, with even for refugees who are still wandering across the world, because we don't know to where we can be routed or which country can host us. From global community, it's maybe it's good to receive or expect, because I don't know how to say even demand. No, I cannot demand.
You can say whatever you want to say. It's free, open civic space.
Yes. But of course, long-term partnership and founding, because this short-term funds and short-term research, it just exhausting us, because I cannot apply even for 2 or 3 months research, because for me it's too risky, and I cannot participate in this. And of course we cannot provide consultation, 6 months consultations before implementation, big grant, because from today, like next month, it will be different story, different situation, different risks, and all this assessment not relevant anymore. And this is a problem. And of course, it's building trust, at least on a horizontal level, because we need this trust.
Thank you so much. With that, we have around 10 minutes or so for Q&A or comments from the audience. So I think we can pass the mics. Yeah. So please, we can take maybe 1 round of questions, but if time permits, we may take more, but if not, at least we can take 1 round of questions. One there.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Aaron from Acted Canada. My question is on a newer civil space of social media. I was wondering if it's making your life easier, harder, also in the different contexts across the world. I was interested in if it's being used differently. So
We could take a couple of more questions, and then we can, there's one here.
Thank you very much. My name is Ziaur Rahman, and I'm from basically Pakistan. I work with Asia Development Alliance. Interesting presentations. While OEBC was speaking, I was resonating with him because we have the similar situation in Pakistan and in many countries in Asia. So I have a question. You didn't talk about those systemic challenges actually that are actually creating these civic rights and spaces issue. So while we were having interaction with the civil society at the grassroots level, they were complaining that there are certain instruments that are being launched by the Western countries, which are actually being used as vehicle for creating challenges for the civic rights and spaces in the global South. So do you see that this is really the case? Our governments are like more like they are using those vehicles or not? Okay, so this is one question. The second question to my Afghan colleague, I don't know if that fits into this context and whether the Civil 7 can raise this question to the G7, that at one end, some of our global powers are in negotiation with the Afghan Taliban. And do we have this courage to highlight those challenges in our Civil 7 communique and ask them that, you know, why should we legitimize Talibans and going into a negotiation with them on several issues? So maybe if you can just reflect a little bit on that with your perspective as a human rights activist. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Hi, my name is Minaz Kerawala. I'm with Development and Peace Caritas Canada. And my question is to Kim, and I apologize in advance for posing what might be a brutal, triggering question. What do you do when you said you're trying to convince people that these retreats and funding and support will actually cost lives? But what do you do if your interlocutor doesn't think that's a bad thing? If losing an entire community is seen as a desirable outcome, how do you deal with that?
Maybe one last question. Okay. Or two last questions.
Hi, thanks so much for today's conversation. My name's Robin Montgomery, and I'm with the HIV Legal Network, based out of Toronto. I don't really have a question very well formulated, so please forgive me. But I think my question is directed towards all of you, but particularly Kim. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So in an era where we're seeing an erosion on all sorts of democratic rights and freedoms, and we're seeing an erasure not only of language progress, but also history, that included groups of societies, where is there possibility to flip the script and perhaps reclaim some of that narrative that goes back to the roots of global solidarity and humanity and dignity and rights? I think we're all in desperate need of it. It's just, where do we start? Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Harjeet Singh from Satat Sampada Climate Foundation based in New Delhi, and thank you very much for a very insightful conversation. I would like to underline the point Olusei made on the subnational level work, and that's a reality which really doesn't get highlighted as much, because when you see activists working on ground whose work is not really captured by national media, in fact, they are the ones who are doing a lot more dangerous work than people working at the national level or writing articles. Number of cases where we have seen whether they are exposing human rights violations or environmental degradation, mining and so on, they actually face real danger. And I think it's really important for us as civil society to recognize that and support movement and activists a lot more at the local level. Second point is quite connected with what the previous speaker just said in terms of solidarity. We are living at a time when, of course, we are seeing aid being cut and civil space is shrinking. This is a time when we need a lot more solidarity between the global north and global south. And of course, with less resources, it's becoming a lot more challenging. So it would be good to know what are your thoughts on how we can continue, or rather ramp up actions connecting the global north and global south as we are facing similar challenges. And when we talk about civic space, and most of the time, and even on this panel, we are talking a lot more about the global south. But the situation in global north is not the same as it was a couple of years ago. Let's also talk about the civic space in the UK or Australia, or now look at what's happening in the US. So we are facing quite similar. So of course, in the global south, it's far more dangerous than in the global north because of the human rights freedoms and the legal system. But let's talk about the shrinking space, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. And my last point is about the role of global media. We have seen how global media does play an important role, especially at a time when the space for local media, independent media, is actually shrinking. They are being crushed, or they are now in the pockets of industrialists. How do we look at that? And we have also seen positive examples. When we heard stories being captured by the global media, we saw leaders acting nationally, locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we have only a few minutes. Why don't we take each 2 minutes to sort of respond to one of the questions or share any final comments or remarks you may have. I'm going to start with you, Cam, and then...
Okay, great. I had two directly aimed at me, although I'd love to take on the social media one as well, but maybe I'll leave that to some of my colleagues and we can have a conversation later, because I have a lot to say about social media. The question about what do we do when they don't care? Good point. And I had this debate with some of my colleagues the other day about, you know, is there a systematic approach to erasure that's happening? And I said, I just think they don't care. I don't think it's systematic. I think they don't care. So what we have to do in the case of they don't care is find out what they care about and go from that angle. And so we're seeing a lot more of this kind of work happening. So talking about the economic costs of exclusion, for instance, where does that hit them in the pocketbooks? Looking at, when we look at the P7 summit that happened in Japan, for instance, I was completely impressed by the corporate actors that came to speak and talked about the fact that they just cannot recruit the high-level executives that they need to recruit because of the domestic laws in Japan. So it's those kinds of arguments. Find out what they do care about, find if they care about democracy, talk about how democracy is destabilized in these kinds of scenarios. Even if they don't care about our lives, talk about what they do care about. That's one strategy. And the other question about how we can flip the script, one of the things we need to talk about is history, and that's lost a lot. And I did a very in-depth interview with my counterparts in Argentina about what happened in the election there. Because we had, in Argentina, large numbers of youth, in particular, like very progressive youth, vote for the current government there on the belief that they will not roll back our rights. That's not going to happen. We're here. Well, how did you get here? How did that happen? And in order to understand how that happened, how we got to the position that we're in now, we have to understand the history of our movements. And I think that's lost in a lot of cases, especially for our younger folks. So there's a number of organizations that we work with that are doing a lot of history lessons. I'm doing one in the fall, a big workshop on LGBTI history in Canada. We're about to have a new national monument built down the road here that's going to talk about the history of the LGBT movement in Canada and the purge within the Federal Civil Service, RCMP. So these are the types of historical kinds of work that we have to do to remind the young people about how they got to where they got and why we are in the place that we're in. I'm sorry, I'm speaking particularly in Canada here, but this is really important to create those moments and those opportunities. Although other people have talked about museums of memory and dialogue, we cannot lose that. People need to understand that.
Yeah, I think mine would be to start by thanking Cooperation Canada for this conversation, and to say that in terms of insight, wisdom, and maybe foresight for solidarity that needs to happen, there's an opportunity for Cooperation Canada to take leadership of how what Adit said around the global north and global south finding that solidarity. I think there's an opportunity for that. The other bit is to talk about the social media element and to use the last 3 months as an example, particularly when the information on the foreign funding freeze started. And now we've seen a growing dis and misinformation around the work that civil society organizations receiving foreign funding, they may have witnessed, including how maybe the algorithm itself has been, programmed to now spotlight some of these things. Over the last 4 months, I have tracked conversations, particularly around the Nigerian element of things, and I've seen how users of social media, particularly X, have called out non-profits, but also have now directly attacked those who may have led protests or may have supported protests and linked them to foreign funding. And that might link to what Zia mentioned around how our leaders have always said that as local civil society, we don't often have our thoughts, that we are being teleguided or being asked to do things because we are receiving foreign funding. So that has received a lot of boost in the last 4 months, and it is actually putting civil society organizations that are on the front lines in huge risks, for the type of work that they do. So social media right has helped to give visibility to our work. It has also helped to increase disinformation and a lot of negative narratives around the sector. And we don't seem to have the capacity to be able to counter those narratives because they are just everywhere. But maybe it's to also mention that civil society is often misunderstood. And if you have listened to conversations again around funding, you understand that not everyone understands what we do or what we stand for, how we do our work, and how all of that connects to either businesses or to development or to quality of life. So maybe we need to introspect as civil society at some point and find that common narrative, find that common solidarity, but more importantly, find those political and policy innovations that can get us out of this mess that we're in now.
I will be sure. Well, on the issue of negotiation and engagement with the Taliban, while we understand that there is actually a need to continue this sort of engagement, whatever form it might be, because of the dire humanitarian issues that we are facing at the moment. But one thing that we have time and again advocated for, that these countries, including the G7, they should have a principled approach. They should clearly and consistently talk about the gender persecution in Afghanistan and the atrocity crimes and the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities in Afghanistan. And so that's all our hope, that they remain principled in their approach. And again, recently, obviously, some talking about a transactional approach, and because of the development and the recent development in the United States, and because of this guy is actually so transactional. But of course, that's something that we have seen transactional in the last 20 years, so we do not want that. And we should not step away from our principles, which is, and the most important thing is the women's rights in Afghanistan. And I think, on the issue of solidarity, because it's really key and important for us, and one of the strategies actually that is working for us in exile that I wanted to share is, building this horizontal solidarity networks in coalition. And I think when it comes to the issue of gender apartheid in Afghanistan, so we have been, running this campaign, and now, this is in the UN 6 committee, and hopefully, that will be codified under the Crimes Against Humanity. So certainly the women of Afghanistan need more solidarity on that and more support, be it from the global north or global south. And I don't know how many how many civil societies are actually from the Muslim world, because even for the ICJ case, International Court of Justice, and because of the violation of CEDAW, unfortunately, we didn't find any Muslim country to step in and support that process, and that is quite unfortunate. Yeah. So, and more support obviously from them is also needed. Thank you.
As a civil society and the civil society in Ukraine, we don't need to be idolized, and but we need to be heard. And civil society is not the perfect, but essential. And we are holding mirror in front of the government, and we can reflect something and point things which need to be addressed to the government, and we all trying to build safe and prospective future, but with more equality, with more humanity, with everything better. And I feel very sad when government starting attack civil society, because it's just a reflection, and they need to use this reflection to build something better.
Thank you so much. Big thanks to our panelists for being candid, open, and generous with sharing their ideas, their experiences, and what they're planning to do. So big round of applause to all our panelists. And I'm not going to really attempt to, in any way, summarize this really rich discussion, and I wouldn't be able to do justice to it anyway, but just to remind ourselves, we are in a time of crisis. There are two types of crises. One is, or emergencies. One is that, an earthquake happens, and there's a flooding, or there's a immediate conflict that takes place, and we kind of know, we have built systems and procedures how to respond to that. And then there are crises or emergencies that happen slowly, that, step by step, country by country, groups of vulnerable people by groups of vulnerable. So that is where we don't have a playbook to respond to that kind of crisis. Climate is one, and civic space is another. We have been in a state of crisis for almost 20 years now, from what I can remember, and it hasn't yet registered globally in our mind that, the very freedom that we take so dear at heart in here in Canada, but also around the world, is not, it's at risk. And we don't see it that way. It doesn't affect us immediately. It's not like tariffs where, it's going to affect our food and the dining table or our paychecks. But it happens slowly and gradually. And if we don't register it, and if we don't treat it with the kind of urgency that it requires, the chances are those of us in Canada, those of us in another country that take this freedom, this rights for assembly, for association, for expression, that we take this so for granted. It's part of who we are, part of identity. These are at risk. Nobody, like a year ago, nobody thought that in the US, you will no longer be able to talk about inclusion, diversity, but it is just south of our border here. Italy, another G7 country, also, I don't know, we have people from Italy as well here, also put on Civica's watch list for countries, along with the US, for countries that need to watch because of the shrinking of civic space there. Generally on that list, you would see countries, like China, like Russia, and Belarus, and countries in the Middle East. Now that list includes US and Italy. And we don't know, if we don't take action today, if the G7 doesn't take action today, that list will get longer and longer, and it will include all of us. So instead of attempting to summarize this rich conversation, I just want all of us to take a moment to treat this situation as a crisis that requires immediate action at our organizations, at our schools, at our families, but also at our government level and at the sort of global multilateral institutions. With that, thank you so much.